When I was in seminary, my daughter attended an elementary school that was just about 5 blocks from the seminary housing. So most days, I would walk the 5 blocks after final bell to greet Kat, and then we would walk home together. I remember one walk in particular. I don't know if lunch that day at school was not to her liking, or if she had just been particularly active that day, but she was hungry. Hungry, capital H. "Mama, I'm hungry," she complained. "We'll be home in just a few minutes. It's 5 blocks, it's not far to go." "But Mama, I'm hungry now," she cried. I kept telling her I don't have anything with me, but we'll be home in just a few minutes. But she was not appeased. She was sure, convinced that she was going to perish from hunger. Instead of my happy, funny, loving child was this angry, complaining, demanding monster who wanted me to change things for her right now. She was not herself. Have you seen the Snickers commercials? You're not yourself when you're hungry. There's a whole slew of them. One I saw recently shows 2 guys and some middle-aged, way overdressed lady pushing a car, and she's like, "Oh, it's too hot," and I'm doing all the work, and oh, my manicure. And finally one of the guys hands her a Snicker bar, and she takes a bite, and it's another guy, and the tagline, "You're not yourself when you're hungry." Well, the children of Israel are hungry, and of course they're not happy about it. Perhaps they should be happy, because after all, they're no longer slaves in Egypt, but their newfound freedom is not all rainbows and puppy dogs, is it? In fact, their new situation is full of peril and hardship. Can we blame them for wondering what is next? What are we going to eat, and how are we going to make it? Wilderness is truly a place of chaos and death. Especially back in antiquity, no superhighways cut through rock or bridge ravines to carry the traveler safely from one oasis to the next. No rest stops filled with convenience food and house-sized coolers filled with beverages. It's just wind and rocks and ravines. It's little wonder the Old Testament writers return to the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness as a metaphor to describe times when people experience upheaval and turmoil. The wilderness experience can, of course, take many forms: a family crisis, a loss of relationship or identity, a health crisis, a change in jobs or a loss of a job, a betrayal, or that time when you find yourself challenged by new thoughts that rock your faith or beliefs. The world we knew suddenly changes. Sometimes, maybe even for the better, but we're confused and frightened. The Israelites had been set free and were on their way to the promised land, but they were still operating under slavery thinking. The food supplies they had brought out of Egypt were exhausted, and they longed for the good old days and accused Moses of bringing them into the desert to starve them to death. They began complaining about their hardship. We're not ourselves when we're hungry. Theologians point out that people who complain about their conditions are really complaining about God's provision for them. Israel was no different, but God's response to the Israelites was not what we expected, perhaps. We might expect that God would take them to the theological woodshed. You know, set them straight about a few things. I'm the Almighty One who brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. We might expect God to tell them to shut up and experience a little gratitude for their liberation. That might be what we expect, but we'd be wrong. Because God rains bread and gives them meat to eat in the evening. And they didn't even have to work for it, except to go out and collect it. All they had to do was to go out and gather in what God had provided. The only caveat was to not take more than they need. In the morning, when the dew lifted from the ground, there was a flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. They didn't know what it is. I always thought that was hysterical. Manna literally translates, what is it? It was right there in front of their tents. Why didn't they notice it before? Did they just not get up early enough before? Or maybe this was a seasonal thing and it wasn't happening before, but was happening now? What fascinates me about this story is that the answer to their cries, the answer to their need was right there in front of them every morning, and they overlooked it. They complained about their hunger, and the next morning, right where it had been all the mornings before, was this unknown substance that could be turned into bread. Not the bread they were used to in Egypt, but bread for today, for this season of their lives. And it was right there in front of them, something within their grasp. But instead of realizing God's blessings, they complained. They struggled to see that this flaky, unknown thing could be made into bread. It didn't look like the flour they had in Egypt. They were still holding on to what was, instead of looking to see what could be. And this is where I enter the story. If I were a part of the Israelite camp, I'd probably be complaining too. In fact, I have. There have been many times where I've been convinced that the journey was too long and the road too hard, and I was hungry and tired. I felt a bit like that when I moved here almost 2 years ago. I was lost every time I left the parking lot. Every time. I turned the wrong way every single time, and sometimes I would try and psych myself out and turn the opposite way of the way I thought I wanted to go. It was always wrong. The grocery stores were not the same. My bread it's not the same bread that was on the West Coast. Well, of course it is, but the wrapping was different. I remember one day in particular where I was just struggling to find my way, and I was tired of not knowing the streets. It felt like my skin was too tight, and I decided I needed to get to Target. And I was following my GPS and trying to write the road signs and not sure about the exits. Do I need to be on the right? Do I need to be on the left? How do I merge this? I finally get into the parking lot of Target, and I walk in. And of course, it is not set up like the Target in Salem, Oregon. My poor meager circuits were blown. I just had to leave. I went and sat in my car and called my sister. Nothing is the same here. I don't know where anything is. And she said, settle down. It's going to be all right. And it was. It was. It's easy to complain about not having the bread we're used to and miss seeing the gift that God gives us right in front of us. I don't know about you, but when I pray, I'm looking for God to provide me with plan A, because I've already figured out what the solution to the problem is, and I just need God to get on board with that, right? So I'm praying for plan A because I'm a reasonable person and I can come up with good plans. But a lot of times, God has plan B, and I need somebody else to help me see it. For the Israelites, they were praying for plan A, right? Give us the bread that we were used to in Egypt. Plan B was this unknown flaky substance that when ground up and baked tastes like honey. Plan B is also God's answer to their complaining, and it came to them every morning for the entire time they were in the desert wilderness. The people complained during their hunger, confusion, transition, and discomfort. They were in one of those threshold places, that time between what was and what will be, a place where new possibilities can emerge. The desert wilderness served as a space apart, forcing them to confront their hungers and their greatest fears. We're not stuck physically in the middle of a desert wilderness, but we all have those kinds of threshold moments where we confront our hungers and our greatest fears. A lovely friend of mine from Salem attended a women's retreat right when she was contemplating retirement. Our speaker was a young pastor from Portland who was the pastor of a very progressive church. She challenged us in many ways to step outside our comfort zones. At a meeting to evaluate the retreat, my friend complained about our retreat leader. She felt her message was too challenging. Perhaps, I said, you're feeling wholly discontent. Maybe this uncomfortable feeling is God calling you. My friend went on to discover a retirement that was more ministry-oriented and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. These thresholds of waiting and not knowing where our next is coming are everywhere in life. They're inevitable. During these experiences, sometimes while meeting people, quote the old saying, when God closes a door, God will open another or perhaps a window. The problem is we usually don't think about another door opening because we always go to this door. It's the only door we know. It's the only door we recognize. In these times, we resist leaving behind the lives we've known for fear of the unknown. And while in the desert or in a threshold moment, the most common question we ask is, what now? What next? The Israelites turned back when the road ahead looked difficult and their fears and hungers exposed. The fear of dying in the desert from starvation. There are many ways we experience the wilderness today. How's your journey going? Are the ravines deep and the incline rocky? Where are you experiencing hunger or fear? You know, God not only acknowledged the Israelites' need for food, but God shaped them as a different people, as a new community through their experience. The daily gathering of manna will day by day teach them the necessity of trusting God to see them to the journey's end, moment by moment, day by day. We need God's presence and provision every day, not just on Sundays, not just now and then, but because we are on a sacred journey. We pray every week, give us this day our daily bread, because we need God's help in the day that we're living, not yesterday or tomorrow, but right now. We're on a sacred journey becoming God's people, here and now. There are still oppressive systems that need to be confronted and overcome. There are still people enslaved in need of the good news that liberation has come and hope is here. We're on a sacred journey of being transformed into the likeness of Christ. It's not an easy journey, and so many places along the way, we may be tempted to turn back, even if it means returning to systems that lead to death rather than life. Why? because we know what that door looks like and what that bread tastes like. But the way to transformation goes through the wilderness. My daughter Kat thought she would perish from hunger in 5 blocks. That seemed reasonable to a 5-year-old brain. I don't want to minimize our troubles or the difficulties of our journey. Yet I also want to remind us that when we're afraid, we forget God's abundance and complain that God isn't working fast enough to meet our needs, even though God is mighty enough to meet our needs. And God is always faithful and continues to provide over and again, even in the midst of our complaining, forgetfulness, and impatience. And God is always standing with us, especially in those in-between times when we face our hungers and fears. God promises to be with us, and God can do anything far more than we can ask or imagine, even satisfy our hungers in the midst of our complaining. So come to the table today and receive bread for your journey. Today, let it be a reminder that God is with us and God provides. Amen.